In America, many Christians consider it a point of pride to have as literal an interpretation of their scriptures as possible.
Actually, biblical Christianity in America has been in the minority for a while now, and the absurdities in these videos, as well as the comments that go along with them, are evidence of that. So I disagree with what Taylor is claiming from the start, but it's also worth pointing out how fallacious the statement is. After all, how many is many? Is it a majority? Or perhaps it's just more than a few? What was the data used to come to this conclusion? Did Taylor go out and poll churchgoers himself? And is having a literal interpretation a good thing or a bad thing? What constitutes literal? Since the Bible contains over 200 different types of figures of speech, do literalists account for these? Well, maybe they do, and maybe they don't. Taylor doesn't tell us. All we've got is his word stating that Christians pride themselves on having as literal interpretation as possible. But how good is Taylor's word? I don't know him, and chances are most viewers don't either. We do have these videos, though, and perhaps they will help us get a clearer picture of his character and integrity. Now, I'm not quite sure why we would throw out basic principles that we would use to study any other form of literature when it comes to the Bible. But at the end of part 1 of his Do You Know Your Bible series, Taylor ends by stating that his thesis, quote, opens up a whole new can of worms, end quote. And the only can being opened up by this video is a can of nonsense, because Taylor's created a whole new form of hermeneutic, one that can only be described as a raping and pillaging of the text itself. Now, Taylor's video starts off claiming that, quote, this series will reveal some of these passages that pastors rarely teach as your knowledge and obedience to the Holy Bible is put to the test. Does it? Hardly. Asking questions about why Gentile Christians don't follow the Mosaic Law may be innocent enough for those who are simply curious, but the inflamed diatribe that Taylor embarks on in order to try to establish that Christians should follow the laws of Moses is quite contrived. It demonstrates a very poor handling of the text, and while it may dupe the ignorant, it simply causes the rest of us to scratch our heads and wonder. Taylor's whole contention is that Christ didn't fulfill the law, or at the least, the Bible is inconsistent. When on the one hand, the Bible asserts that the law is eternal, yet on the other hand, Christ is the end of the law, which I'll be addressing in response 1-3. In the process, Taylor does some pretty fancy handling of the text. He wastes no time jumping into Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 19. But do you notice something missing here? In Matthew 5, verse 17, Jesus states, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And then in Matthew 5, verse 19, Jesus states, therefore whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, it's bad enough that Taylor will insist that these commandments that Jesus is speaking of in Matthew 5:19 are the commandments throughout the rest of the Bible, but there's no reason to pigeonhole every command in the Old Testament into the context of Matthew 5:19, as we'll see in response 1-3. But Taylor never acknowledges what Christ's fulfillment of the law means in light of the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. The very fact that Taylor brushes off the answer from GotQuestions.org illuminates quite a bit as to how much Taylor actually knows about the Bible and Christianity in general. To point out that Christ himself states he didn't come to abolish the law and then miss what that means through his fulfillment of the law is very telling. But let's go ahead and play Taylor's game and set aside whether or not Christ fulfilled the law by the end of his first coming. Some of you may have noticed that Matthew 5:18 was absent in Taylor's quotation, which has Jesus saying, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Now that puts a different spin on things, because even if Christ's first coming wasn't the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, last I checked, earth is still here. And that brings us to the question, what exactly is the law and the prophets? Well, what Taylor doesn't tell you is that Jesus answers that for you in Matthew 7, verse 12, which just happens to come from the same sermon that's being given in Matthew 5, verse 17. Jesus says in Matthew 7, verse 12, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." This is further illustrated by Jesus again in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40, where Jesus states, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So one has to wonder why Taylor is belaboring an issue that's not only cleared up in the same book, but in the very same passage. Now that we've established a definition for the law and the prophets, the erroneous picture that Taylor attempts to paint, namely that Jesus and his disciples broke the law, is nothing more than childish scribble. In my next installment, we'll go through the Old Testament verses that Taylor uses in part 1 of his Do You Know Your Bible series. Prepare to be amazed as Taylor's handling of the text becomes more and more telling.
We've only just begun to live. White lace and pride.